Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to our weekly meeting with Dr. Lilienthal. There's been some issues with the main room. It looks like 29 of us have made it into the share room. We're sorry for the inconvenience, but it'll be fixed hopefully sooner than later. Dr. Lilienthal, did I forget anything? Oh yeah, please mute yourself.
Thank you so much,
Take it
Ellen.
away.
Good. So everybody, please mute yourselves. You are more than welcome to unmute whenever you want to speak, of course. And we're on lesson 5. I don't know how we can be on lesson 5 already, but we are on lesson 5. And we're going to discuss Sefer HaMitzvot, which is the book that Maimonides wrote with a list of commandments. A couple of introductory comments. First of all, this book was written in Arabic. It was translated by Rabbi Tibon, Moshe Ibn Tibon, into Hebrew. And the important thing to know here is that this is not new. Meaning Maimonides did not come up with this brilliant idea, oh, let me prepare a list of all of the commandments. That was not his original idea. There had been several books that were doing that. I just added 4 there, but there are more than these. And all of them listed the 613 commandments, as well as summarized their main features of each of the commandments, right? The problem is Maimonides criticized all of these commandments, of these books. Literally, he said it was inconsistent. He said it wasn't a good idea, etc. And then he decides to write a book about commandments. And everybody has asked the question throughout history, why the heck, if Maimonides didn't think it was a good idea to have lists of commandments, if he saw a lot of problems with that concept, why the heck would he do this? So with that question in mind, I want to go back to the beginning, okay? Please mute yourselves. Not only did Maimonides decide to write a book about the commandments called Sefer HaMitzvot, literally a book of the commandments, but he used this compilation as the foundation for his most important work, the Mishneh Torah, which we will study in a different lesson. So what's so different about this book? Why did he decide to write a book? So he says the following, and I'm going all over the place right now, but you're going to understand the points that he's making. First of all, it's a systematic classification. It's not just a list, but he classifies the commandments. What does it mean that he classifies the commandments? He actually doesn't like the classification that the other rabbis did. And he therefore listed 14 principles that would be used to classify the commandments. And we will look at the 14 principles. So we know meaning from the Talmud, that there are 613 commandments. And we also know that the Talmud says that of these 613 commandments, 248 are positive, 365 are negative. A positive commandment is something that you have to do. A negative commandment is something that you're not allowed to do. So the difference is one is you shall and the other one is you shall not, okay? The sages that had written before codified all of the mitzvot in terms of counting and indicating variations in each commandment. The Rambam said, I don't like that. I don't like that. What I want to do is, first of all, I want to know what is a biblical commandment, because we do have commandments that are not biblical. So for example, lighting Shabbat candles is not a biblical commandment. Nowhere in the Torah is it said that one needs to light Shabbat candles. It is a rabbinic addition. So he wanted to make a very strong differentiation between what is Torah commandment and what is rabbinic commandment. Now, why was that important to him? I mean, it makes no difference, right? I have to light Shabbat candles anyway. So who cares if it came from Torah or if it came from the rabbis? For Maimonides, this was fundamentally important. So what I'm going to say now is Maimonides' view, not necessarily our view. For Maimonides, Torah is the source of Jewish life, and it is the guide that teaches us how to live in the world as a Jew. Torah is divine, and there is one author and one author only, and that author is God. That's Maimonides' belief. So what he says is, because of this, there's a huge difference in the legal status of a commandment, a mitzvah, that is biblical or that is rabbinic. Also, there are customs that become law. For example, a male wearing a kippah is a custom that became law. It is also not law originally, but it became law. So for Maimonides, it was really important to understand what's custom, what's superstition, what is law. And for him, when he compares this with the secular legal system, he says, here's the difference. Any legal system that is not Judaism, that is not religious, what it does, it's not dependent on one source. On the contrary, right? It takes laws from different periods, statutes from different cultures, and it brings it together. He says, Judaism, you can't do that. You can't take, oh, but this is the culture and this is what people are doing, etc. Because Torah, according to Maimonides, is concerned about keeping the authenticity and the veracity of its laws. So I can't just change laws because I feel like that, or because, this is not a law anybody is practicing, let's get rid of it. Or on the contrary, like, well, but everybody is doing this, why are we not going to do that too? So Maimonides is really careful in making that differentiation. That's the first thing. Second thing is, Maimonides refuses to classify mitzvot in any other way than positive and negative. What I mean by that is, a lot of us tend to, and it is normal, and even the rabbis that had written those codes before Maimonides, we seem to somehow hierarchy of commandments, right? So for example, even if I look just the 10 commandments, most people think the 10 commandments are more important than the other 603. Maimonides says, no, they're not. Within the 10 commandments, most people would say, well, do not murder is more important than observe Shabbat. Maimonides would say, no, it's not. And he would say every single commandment comes directly from God and is equally important to God. God didn't say this comes first, this comes second, this comes third. Okay? So the problem of trying to have a category is that then we're saying some things are more important than the others. We're giving it a value. And Maimonides says that undermines the entire philosophy of the Torah. It may seem to you that one commandment is more important than the other, but that's just your human limitation. So just because you don't think that mixing linen and wool is a big deal, which most of us wouldn't think that mixing linen and wool is a big deal, Maimonides says that doesn't mean at all that God thinks that this is not a big deal. For God, if this is in the Torah, this is important, and it is as important as do not murder. Now, I know we roll our eyes when we say this, like, really? But that's because we have a limited human understanding of what commandments are and what they are here to do. Okay, so we're looking at it from a perspective of human beings. And Maimonides is saying, it makes no difference what you think. What really matters is what God thinks. So far, any questions? I don't know if Joan is connecting. Henry, go ahead.
Dr. Lilienthal, I wasn't sure. So are we saying that Maimonides distinguishes between Torah commandments and rabbinic just to classify them? Or does he feel that rabbinic is not as important?
It's not that he feels that rabbinic is not important, but he feels that rabbinic does not have the same standing as biblical. So not that they're not important, but that there is a difference in biblical commandments and rabbinic commandments. In other words, rabbinic commandments can, to a small degree, but can be changed by rabbis. Torah commandments cannot be changed by rabbis, right? A rabbi cannot say, well, the world is now different, but no, there is no such thing. So I'll give you an example, a practical example of how Maimonides sees this. Again, I will repeat this several times because if somebody comes in the middle of the class and has not heard me saying, I want to make sure that they hear me saying this. I'm not speaking about my personal beliefs. I'm speaking about Maimonides. So Maimonides would say to you, the Torah says no homosexual sexual relationships, right? That cannot be changed. It makes no difference that the world is different now. It cannot be changed. It is the biblical commandment, okay? For Maimonides, rabbinic commandments, we can discuss. So for example, you can't have chicken parmesan. Okay, that's a rabbinic commandment. That's not even a commandment. The commandment is not to mix meat and milk, and the rabbis came to the conclusion that that is part of not mixing meat and milk. Well, that maybe we can discuss. Maybe. Okay, the idea, for example, of not eating rice and beans and etc. on Pesach, that became a law. It became a law from the rabbis. It is not a Torah law, and therefore it can be discussed. But if it's in the Torah, it cannot be changed. I don't care how much the world changes. That's, again, Maimonides' views. So for him, it is very important to know, is it Torah or is it rabbinic? If it's rabbinic, there's a little bit of a leeway. If it's Torah, there is zero leeway. God said it, God wrote it, it is what it is. You don't like it, too bad. Don't follow it. I mean, that's your personal choice with any commandment. But don't change it.
So Maimonides was a big proponent of the Talmud, the oral tradition. And my understanding from what I did a little bit of reading was that the Jewish sect, the Karaites, did not approve, they didn't support the oral tradition, and he came down really heavily against them.
Correct.
But he forgave them. So does that mean that he feels or doesn't feel the oral tradition is important?
No. So here's the difference between Maimonides and the Karaites. The Karaites says the rabbis have no authority to be writing anything and changing anything. Maimonides does not say that. Maimonides does not at all say that. Maimonides respects Talmud. Maimonides builds on Talmud, but Maimonides, for example, we have our last lesson in this course, session 10, we're going to discuss the controversies, and I will go into a lot more detail then. But one of the things that is important to know, Maimonides was not loved by everybody. And one of the reasons Maimonides was not loved by everybody was exactly this. He said, this learning of Talmud in yeshiva, that's really not that important. Learn the Torah and take my book of law and learn my book of law. That's all you need to learn. Interestingly enough, in today's world, is everybody familiar with Daf Yomi? If somebody is not familiar with Daf Yomi, please let me know that you're not. Raise your hand if you do not know what Daf Yomi is. Okay. There's a custom. Daf means page. Yom is day. There is a custom in the Jewish world, in the Orthodox Jewish world. There is a custom of learning a page of Talmud every day. It's called Daf Yomi. And it takes 7.5 years to go through the entire Talmud. And every 7.5 years, a new cycle starts. And every day you learn a page of Talmud. That is normal in the Orthodox world. Chabad, the Rebbe said, we don't need to learn a page of Talmud. That's nonsense. We need to learn a page of Maimonides. So what Chabad does is not Daf Yomi, which is a page of Talmud. Chabad does a mitzvah every day. Every day they learn one or two of Maimonides' commandments, which is really interesting because that's exactly what Maimonides had wanted. He said, don't have to study the Talmud. We're going to see in a minute why Maimonides didn't think we needed to study the Talmud. And I think that there is a very good point, also a very poor point. But I'll get there in a minute. Alexander and then Annette.
Yeah, I have a very fundamental question.
Okay.
So on Har Sinai, we were given the Ten Commandments, and others say also oral law was given at the same time, but it was given orally. So my question is, the 5 books that he's saying are the Torah, so when did that come about, and where was it written, and was it written by people? Was it written by God? What, to explain that?
Torah, in his mind, is 100% by God. It's not even Moshe. Moshe was the actual scribe, but imagine a tape recorder, okay? A tape recorder, I know, I have just dated myself.
So it doesn't say any place that, where does it say in the Torah that it was written?
Say that again.
Who wrote the Torah? In the 5 books itself, where does it say that? Who actually wrote the 5 books?
So it does say that these are the words. Maimonides sat down and wrote the words. Not Maimonides, sorry. Moshe sat down. Moshe wrote the words. It does say in Deuteronomy.
That he wrote
Now,
the word.
The question is, what words? Which words were written by Moshe? The entire 5 books? The 5 books minus the 8 last verses, which talk about Moshe's death? I mean, then there are all these conversations about it. But for Maimonides, Torah is the word of God, literally the word of God. I think that what Maimonides thinks, right, which, let's face it, I'm going to ask everybody here to accept for 1 minute. I'm going to ask everybody to accept that every single word of the Torah was given by God to Moshe on Mount Sinai. I'm also going to ask you to accept that every single word that is in the Talmud was given to Moshe on Mount Sinai. Okay? And that it is passed down orally for about 2,000, whatever, 1,500 years, whatever it could be. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm asking you to believe in that. Just go from that premise. God gave every word to Moshe for the 5 books. God gave every word to Moshe for the oral Torah. And what happens then? Moshe writes the 5 books, and the rest he passes down orally to the next generation. I'm going to ask you to accept that as a premise. Now I'm going to ask you, what is the likelihood that what the rabbis wrote 1,000 years later is exactly what God said to Moshe on Mount Sinai? And the truth is, we've all played telephone. You put 3 people one next to the other from the first to the third, the message has changed. Right? So I think Maimonides is looking at it from that perspective. God may have given it, but it cannot be as accurate as the words that Moshe wrote sitting next to God, so to speak, with God saying, right, and Moshe goes, you am the Lord your God, and Moshe writes, am the Lord your God. I mean, it's completely accurate. But the rest, how can you say that it is accurate? So I think that's where Maimonides is coming from. Be that as it may, for him, there is a huge difference between what is a biblical commandment, what is a rabbinic commandment. And Risa added in the chat that rabbinic law gets changed. Right? Rabbinic law gets changed. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't observe it. I'm going to give an example. There is a rabbinic law from the year 1000 that a man may not have more than 1 wife. Not a single Jew today can get up and say, hey, The Bible doesn't say that. On the contrary, the Bible allows for more women. Therefore, I want to observe the law of the Torah, which is I can have as many women as I want. Nobody's going to say that. And if you say, I mean, I guess you can say it, but there is no rabbi that's going to say, oh, you have a point, it's from the Bible, right? Rabbinic law becomes law, but it is important to understand that rabbinic law, according to Maimonides, is influenced by society, by customs, which Torah law is not. Torah law is directly God's will, not an interpretation, not an adaptation. It is God's will. Again, that's in the eyes of Maimonides, okay? Scholarly theories, of course, are different, but Maimonides is writing from that perspective. Annette.
Hi, I wanted to ask, how did he then accept the fact that a lot of laws are to do with the temple in Jerusalem that doesn't exist?
Not a problem whatsoever, because he believes that the temple will exist. It didn't exist for a period of time, X number of years, but it will exist. So it's not an issue. These laws the laws are still valid. They cannot be observed. But remember, out of the 613 commandments, there is not a single human being that can observe all of them. Why? Because not all commandments apply to everybody. There are commandments that apply only to women. If you are a man, that doesn't apply to you. You can't do that one. There are commandments that apply only to men. If you're a woman, that doesn't apply to you. There are commandments that apply only to firstborn. If you're not a firstborn, it doesn't apply to you. There are commandments that only apply if you're living in the land of Israel. If you're not living in Israel, it doesn't apply to you, and so on, right? I mean, I can keep going. If you're a Cohen, so nobody fulfills all commandments. So for example, I cannot fulfill the commandment of Shemitah, right? With the idea that on the 7th year, the land has to rest. I mean, if I want to make my land here rest, I can do whatever I want, but it's not a commandment. The commandment is for those who own land in Israel. But if I move to Israel and buy agricultural land, then that law applies to me. So you can't do anything now because you don't have a temple, but when the temple is rebuilt, which Maimonides believes it will be, then all of those laws are immediately in place, immediately. Which, as a parenthesis here, is why, if you don't know about this, there is a Kohanim Institute in Israel, where people who are considered Kohanim can come and learn. Because what happens if the temple is restored tomorrow? Somebody needs to know what to do. So they learn about all of the rituals and all of the laws so they can be prepared and ready. Brenda, yes, the laws of the country that we live supersede only to a certain extent. And I will say that I have seen in the last few months something that I was unfamiliar with, the number of Orthodox Jews that will not take their legal cases to court. They will only go to a Beit Din. The reason I'm bringing this up is because I used to think that they only did this in cases like of a divorce, etc. But no, like for everything, they simply will not go to secular court. They will go by Jewish law. They go to a rabbinic court, and that's where they deal with their differences, one party against another. For commercial law, for family law, for a whole bunch of things. They simply do not even go to the secular law. For them, it doesn't apply. Now, I'm not saying that it doesn't apply. If the law of the country says, you know, there's a speed limit, then yes. But if it is a interpersonal issue, they will go to the rabbinic court and not to the secular courts. Risa.
I was going to add, and I'm confident that everybody realizes this, but I just want to add, and forgive my voice, that if there is going to be an inquiry about a change in rabbinic law, no matter what movement, this is where I don't care to use the word movement, but we have to in this case, that it's not taken lightly. Sometimes these changes with rabbinic law take months and months and months.
Years.
Because it's not just something you can do overnight. It's so much discussion, so much controversy, so much debate, voting, you name it, and it really does take a long time.
100%. And I always said that, to me, one of the important things is if you ever are studying responsa are legal Jewish answers from the different movements. If you are looking at responsa, you can always look at what's the end result, right? So, for example, Reform Judaism decided to accept patrilineal descent, or conservative movement decided to allow people to drive on Shabbat, okay? I can look at that and say, that's all I need to know. It's the end result. But if you really want to learn Judaism, the best thing you can do is take the responsa and read it. And also read the opposing views, which are all recorded. And that is a true lesson in how rabbinic law works, right? And yes, it is changed. It is changed differently in different movements. But the process, as Risa has said, is absolutely amazing. It really is absolutely amazing because there's a lot of study that goes in. It's not taken lightly. There really is a lot of focus on how to interpret the law, etc. But going back to Maimonides, that's exactly the problem. Maimonides says no matter how careful you are, it is interpretation and it is a human vote. These, X number say yes, Y number say no. X is what is larger than Y, therefore it is approved. Torah law does not have that. There's no X, there's no Y, there's no opinion. God said so. Again, in Maimonides' view. Alexander. Alexander, you're muted.
Many years ago, when I was in yeshiva, I brought up a question about a Norelco shaver, whether that was kosher to use or not, because you were only supposed to use a scissor to cut your beard. And it went to the highest rabbinical authority in New York City. I think it was Rav Moshe Feinstein. And he paskined on that. And he said it was all right to use it because it was considered like a scissor, even though it was an electric, shaver.
That's a great example. There are some rabbis that said you can't, and there are other rabbis that said you can. So it's a different interpretation. Now, that's why there are different opinions among rabbis, and people have to follow whoever their halachic authority is, whoever they decide is going to be their halachic authority, right? One of the things that Judaism says is you're not allowed to search for the answer that you want. You are allowed to go to the rabbi that you think is going to give you the answer that you want. But if he doesn't give you the answer that you want, you can say, okay, I'm going to ask another rabbi. Once you've asked, you've asked. So Moshe Feinstein said you could do it. Amazing. If Moshe Feinstein had said, right, it's called rabbi shopping, exactly. If Moshe Feinstein had said, no, you can't, then you couldn't go to, let's say, Rabbi Lamb and ask, can I do it? You already asked the question, you already got an answer, you have to follow it. Which is why personally, I'm just sharing this personally, I am very careful not to ask a question until I'm absolutely ready to get the answer. Because once I get the answer, I can't say I don't like the answer. Okay, so let's move forward. So the whole question where we stood is, Maimonides has all these problems. Why does he decide to write a book of categories of mitzvot? Why is this important to him? So I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going just to say the following. It is important for Maimonides to write a list of commandments, not because he needs a list of commandments for the sake of a list of commandments. As we will see, here it is, right? Somebody volunteered to read this, please. This is an introduction of Sefer HaMitzvot. And Sefer HaMitzvot is embedded in his Mishneh Torah, which is one of his most famous works that we will discuss a different day. Anybody wants to read
I'm
this?
happy to read it.
Thank you very much. Go.
When I directed my thoughts toward this end, I contemplated how this work should be divided and arranged.
Again, when he's talking about this work, he's referring to Mishneh Torah. It was a book that he was going to write that was supposed to make you not have to use the Talmud anymore. He was going to put everything in one book so that you could just go straight there and get all the answers you wanted. So that's what he's talking about.
It then became obvious to me that the best division would be to do it by groups of laws in lieu of the tractates of the Mishnah. And to that end, I realized that I needed to first enumerate all of the commandments, positive and negative, in the introduction to the work, so that the divided book would still incorporate all of them, and no commandments, positive and negative, in the introduction to the work, so that the divided book would still incorporate all of them, and no commandment would remain without a discussion of all its laws.
Brenda, a little bit more.
This is all to make sure that there is nothing I do not talk about. If I include everything in the enumeration of the commandments, I will be secure and protected from this.
Great. So this is what's happening. Maimonides thinks that learning Talmud doesn't work for the majority of human beings. Why? Because learning Talmud, when you look at a page of Talmud or 2 or 3 or 4, let's say I open a tractate of Shabbat, where I'm going to learn about Shabbat, and I start discussing what kind of candles I'm supposed to light. And then a rabbi says, right, the Talmud is presenting all the conversations with the rabbis. A rabbi says, oh, speaking about lighting Shabbat candles, what's Hanukkah? And they go on a whole conversation about Hanukkah, okay, for pages. Please note, I opened the book because I wanted to know about Shabbat candles. How do I light Shabbat candles? And now there are pages and pages and pages of Hanukkah and the story of Hanukkah and not the story of Hanukkah and the miracle and the Maccabees and well, it's all there. I can't get a straight answer. And Maimonides says the average Jew needs a straight answer. How do I light Shabbat candles? And what a Jew wants is the answer to that question. You take X number of candles, you light it in this way with this kind of material and leave it for X number of hours. This is what they want to know. It says learning Talmud. There are stories, there are examples, there are discussions. By the time I get to the actual decision, we've gone through sometimes 20 pages. People don't have the time for that. Right? It's, you know, when you're talking to your health insurance company, like, don't read to me a document that has 15 pages. I want to know, can I go to this doctor or not? Just give me a yes or no answer. I don't want 15 pages of documents to get to the answer. So Maimonides decides that's what he's going to do. He's going to write this Mishneh Torah. And the way it's going to work is you want to know how to do anything, you open and you find it there. So he says, how am I going to do this? First intention was, I'm going to take the Mishnah, I'm going to take the Gemara, the Talmud, I'm going to read it all, and I'm going to go by tractate. Makes a lot of sense if it weren't for the fact that there are topics that are discussed in 2 or 3 or 4 different tractates. And he says, that's not going to work. So he says, you know what? If I want people to have access to how do I fulfill a mitzvah, the best way to do this is by a list of all of the mitzvot. Then I can explain how a mitzvah has to be observed. Then I know for sure that I will not have skipped anything, that everything will be discussed the way it has to be discussed. Does that make sense? So his list of commandments was not for the purpose of having a list, which is what the other rabbis had done, which is what he was criticizing. Like, what good is it to have a list of commandments? His list of commandments were sort of the equivalent of when you have a week with too many things that you need to do, and you make a list so that you make sure you cover everything. Otherwise, you're going to forget a couple of things. That is the basic idea. Maimonides says, I'm going to make a list of commandments, because if I don't make a list of commandments, I can't write my Mishneh Torah. And therefore, from that basic skeleton, basic foundation, I can then start writing my Mishneh Torah. So let's say the commandment, I'm just going to take any commandment, the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Maimonides himself is going to go through all of the pages of Talmud, 63 tractates, and anything that has to do with that commandment, he's going to codify on that commandment. Then he's going to go to the next one. Yes, I will, Barbara, I will send that to you in a few minutes or by the end of the lesson today. Okay. My suggestion always is not to buy anything, because thank God there's Sefaria, and most of what exists is on Sefaria, and it is free. So I will point to that in a second. So that's the reason why Maimonides decides to write the commandments. And then because he decides to write that, then he has it ready, then he decides to call a book, and he calls it Sefer HaMitzvot. It was never his intention from the beginning to actually do a list of commandments. Okay, so I'm reading something else to you. Give me a second. Okay, this is how he concludes his introduction. Therefore, I saw it fitting to precede this book I mentioned, meaning the Mishneh Torah, with another book, namely this book, in which I will give the correct list of the mitzvot and explain the proper way to count them. I will therefore bring proofs from verses of the Torah and from the explanation of the rabbis on them. I will first give the principles which should be relied upon in listing the mitzvot. It will be unnecessary for me to answer individuals or clarify their errors, for the benefit and goal of this work can be reached by those who seek it without individual correspondence, meaning you can just take the text and you will be able to understand it without an intermediary, which is not the case with Talmud. For I shall explain all of the mitzvot and list them individually, bring proof in any case of doubt, or where there is the possibility that someone without deep knowledge of Torah could err. I will eliminate his error and explain all of his doubts. However, this work's goal is not to give details of any mitzvah, just to enumerate them. Why? Because the details are going to come in the Mishneh Torah. If I do explain some laws when mentioning the mitzvah, it will merely be to explain its name, to know what the mitzvah or prohibition is and why it was given this name. After we know the proper enumeration of mitzvot according to the proofs in this work, then I will list them briefly at the beginning of the general book, that is the Mishneh Torah, that we have mentioned. Okay, so he makes it clear in the introduction. It was never my intention to give you a list of mitzvot. It's just going to be the foundation on which what I have to teach, what I want you to know, is going to be built upon. Joyce. Joyce, make sure you unmute.
Yeah. This is, does anybody know how long it took him to do this?
A long time, about like 20 years.
I mean, because if you think of what else he had to do, I don't know how, a normal person could manage to teach, to practice medicine, to do all the other writing and answer responsa and do everything else that he had to do, and then write something like this, which is, becomes a fundamental, a basic reference source.
Right. So I want you to imagine, it's almost the work of building a Wikipedia.
Yeah.
I take it seriously, right? Without computers, without print, this is all handwritten.
Right.
Right? I mean, yeah, it's incredible. What I would say, Joyce, is when we had that first lesson about him, I don't know if you remember, there was a text there where he mentioned, it was a letter that he wrote, where he mentions that he sleeps very little. Right? I mean, how difficult his life is, that he has to go to Fostat every day in the morning, and then he comes, or he has to go to Cairo every day in the morning, then he comes back to Fostat, and how there are already people waiting for him, and how he has to see everybody, and he goes into the wee hours of the night.
Right, and he's exhausted.
Exhausted. I am not at all comparing. I really am not at all comparing. But the stories that are told about the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, is that he slept 2 to 3 hours a night, not more than that. He used to have people coming in at 2 or 3, 4 in the morning to talk to him. I guess some people are able to function with very little sleep, right? And I also guess everything is relative, because what I think is enough sleep, my kids say I'm completely crazy. It's relative. I guess it depends on the person. But that's basically the way he did it. He slept very little. Now, it's not just that he slept very little. It's obviously that his brain was functioning on very little sleep, which is really important. Most of us, if we sleep very little, your brain's not really functioning. Obviously his was. Alexander?
Just to add to that, there are some people through genetics that are born with the ability of total recall, where they could page and the page becomes a picture in their head and they never forget, and they could go refer back to that page. And he probably had that ability. Now, very few people have that, but there are people who do have that ability, and that would help him compile, these laws and read through pages. He wouldn't have to read it again if he read it once. And he probably had that ability, I would think.
I would have loved that ability. But yes, it's what we would call today photographic memory, but taken to a real, very high level, that you look at a page of Talmud and you remember. Risa, the 10 years is Sefer HaMitzvot or Mishneh Torah? Risa, you're muted.
Yeah, it said it's the Mishneh Torah. Took 10 years for him to compile.
That's interesting. I had 20 years for Mishneh Torah.
Really? Wow.
That's what I had seen. Look, the truth is 20 years would have been amazing. 10 years is just even more amazing. I could sit and try to do something like this in 10 years with internet access, and I wouldn't be able to do it. And it's just amazing that he was able to do it. Okay,
Absolutely.
so with that being said, that was his goal, I would like to share a couple of things more before we go into the principles. Okay, the principles are important, but before we go into the principles, I'd like to share a couple of slides and read to you a couple of things that he wrote. Where is my share? Here we go. So, as we said, he made 2 separate lists, positive commandments and negative commandments. And he wrote an introduction for each of those, which I will read in a minute. Then these lists end up being combined as the subheadings for the Mishneh Torah. Why is it that he did not keep the lists as they are? If he already did 2 separate lists, positive commandments on one side, negative commandments on the other, why does he not build his Mishneh Torah on the list the way he wrote them? And the answer is going to be because he understands that some positive and negative commandments are just the same face of this, different faces of the same commandment, right? So 2 sides of a coin, for example. So if there is a positive commandment and a negative commandment that are basically coming from one main idea, when he discusses it in the Mishneh Torah, he's going to bring those two together. That's why he doesn't follow the list in the way that he wrote it. And another thing is, he makes it very clear what his definition of a mitzvah is, of a commandment is. So, there we go. Okay. So, unlike other rabbis, the other codes that I said that have been already published, lists that have been published, he does not consider every thou shall or thou shall not as a separate commandment. Okay, the way the other rabbis did it was exactly that. Every time there is you must, you should, it's one commandment. If it says you should not, it's a separate commandment. Right? Number two, in his understanding, a commandment is an organizing category of a group of laws, which makes sense because, for example, do not light a fire on Shabbat or rest on Shabbat, which, by the way, are two different commandments. One is do not, the other one is do, right? Positive and negative. That's, do not do any work on Shabbat is a very broad category. It is an organizing category of different laws. He understands the commandment as being that category. And therefore, in order to define for him, this was his working guide, what am I going to consider a commandment and what am I not going to consider a commandment? He made a list of 14 principles. Okay, that's his list. Now, stopping for a second, obviously, it shouldn't come to anybody's surprise that he's making a list of principles, right? That's typical Maimonides. Remember that he listed the 13 principles of faith, right? Maimonides is my mother. Nothing can be done without a list, right? For him, lists are extremely helpful. And I think this is a personality thing. There are some people that cannot live without lists, because that's how they organize their day, their thought process, everything that they're doing. There are people that would go crazy with lists. For Maimonides, and it's easy to understand, this is a guy who has a mathematical brain, a scientific brain. For him, the more things are structured, the easier it is for him to do his work, right? The whole Mishneh Torah is a very structured thing. That's exactly why he's writing a Mishneh Torah. He gets very bothered by the fact that the Talmud is not structured. He likes structure. It's a personality thing. Yeah, I also like lists, Risa. And I cited my mother so I would not have to cite myself. But trust me, I do have lists also. And I used to make fun of my mother, and God has punished me, and now I don't live without lists. Okay. So let me share again my screen, and I'm going to ask for a volunteer to read the introduction of Maimonides for the principles. Because not only does he have principles, but everything has an introduction, right? And then after we read the introduction to the principles and the principles, I'm going to read to you the introduction to the positive mitzvot and the negative mitzvot. So anybody who would like to volunteer to read, please unmute and start. Risa, go ahead.
And now I will begin to discuss the principles totaling 14 to be relied upon enumerating the mitzvot. However, I should first mention that the total of mitzvot commanded to us by God in the Sefer Torah are 613. There are 248 positive commandments, like the number of limbs in the human body, and 365 prohibitions, like the days in the solar year.
So Risa, stop just for a second. Fran, that should answer your question. So because the Talmud says that there are 613, Maimonides went with 613, and all of the other rabbis went with 613. So the first thing that's important for you to know is that we think oh, there are 613 commandments in the Torah because somebody sat down and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And when they got to the end, it was 613. It's not. The rabbi said 613. And then those who wanted to write lists started looking for 613. And if they found more, they had to decide which were going to be added and which were not going to be added. This is important for two reasons. Number one, it is very, quote, coincidental not that we have 248 positive commandments and 365 negative commandments, right? Anybody who has ever either taught or learned in school knows that we try to make things easy to remember. So if I can say, oh, it's 365, like the days in the solar year. Now everybody remembers that there's 665. If I say 248, which is a very difficult number to remember, well, not if I say to you, it's just like the number of limbs in the human body. Now we're all thinking about the number of limbs in the human body. So the rabbis in the Talmud established 613, and all of the rabbis that came up with lists started from that premise. There are 613. Now let me find out which are the 613. Keep going, Risa.
Our sages also said, according to Chumah Kitetze, a drash on the similarity between the mitzvot and the number of limbs, that it is as if each limb tells the person, do a mitzvah with me. And on the similarity of the prohibition and the days of the year, that it is as if each day tells the person, don't do any prohibition on my day. Not a single commentary who lists the mitzvot has erred in this enumeration of the 613 and the division of 248 plus 365. They were totally mistaken, however, at what goes into the list. As I will explain in this work, the reason for this error was because they did not know the 14 principles that I will now explain. Very cool.
One thing I will say about Maimonides, Maimonides was not a humble person at all. Okay. Now, my grandfather would say, you know, people who are humble because they don't have a choice, right? Meaning people who are brilliant don't have to be humble. Okay, maybe. But Maimonides is not at all humble, not at all. He understands that what he's doing is absolutely right and important, and nobody else knows how to do it right. He's the only one that does. So let's go through the principles. I'm just going to ask, so that it's not too boring, I'm going to ask for people to volunteer to read, you know, take one slide. There are always 2 or 3 principles per slide. So if somebody can just volunteer to read the first and the second, we'll be fine. So anybody who wants, just start reading.
The first principle, do not count rabbinic commandments in this list.
Great. So Maimonides is not in the list of Maimonides. You will not see, you shall light Shabbat candles. Okay. Rabbinic commandment. Good. Second.
The second principle, do not include laws which are derived from one of the 13 principles of Torah interpretation of Rabbi Yishmael listed in daily prayers, or from a ribui, an extra word, letter, etc., in a scriptural verse.
So when the other rabbis were writing the list of commandments, sometimes they said, well, but if we change this word, one letter in the word, it'll mean something else, which the rabbis do frequently, or adding one thing that is together with the other and saying they are connected, therefore we can conclude something. Maimonides says, nope. There's nothing with Torah interpretation. If there is a law that is coming from an interpretation, it is not a commandment on my list. Okay? Now, he's not saying that other people can't do it, but he says they're wrong. And on my list, these commandments are not going to appear. Next slide.
Third principle, do not count mitzvot which are not binding on all generations.
So stop here. There is a mitzvah, and this is really important because it's applicable. There is a mitzvah, there is a commandment God says to the Israelites before they cross into the Jordan River and go into the land of Israel, once you cross, you shall get rid of all of the populations that are living there. They're all idolatrous groups. You need to get rid of them. Okay. So there has been the discussion. So when we went back to Israel in 1948, do we not have the same obligation? Because God says, when you go into the land of Israel, kill everybody. And Maimonides, which obviously is not writing about 1948, but in Maimonides' philosophy, nope, that was a mitzvah that was given to that generation and that generation only. So keeping Shabbat is for everybody at all times. But going into the land and getting rid of everybody who's there is limited to this generation. So therefore, it is a mitzvah, but it is not a mitzvah that has to be on our list of 613. It doesn't apply to you anyway. It's no longer valid. It will never be valid again. The temple, yes, the temple is going to be rebuilt. We're going to go back. We need to know those laws. But that kind of thing, getting rid of everybody who's there, that doesn't apply. No longer valid. No longer should be on the list of 613 commandments. Fourth.
The fourth principle, do not count commands that cover all the mitzvot.
So a very broad category is not to be taken into, read as one of the 613 commandments, right? Which makes sense. If he wants to give me a practical guide, something that is philosophically, you should be a good person, that doesn't help me. That doesn't help me at all. I'm trying to learn what I need to do and how I need to live my life. Be a good person is just not something that should fall under the list of mitzvot. Fifth.
The fifth principle, do not count the reason for a mitzvah as the actual mitzvah.
Separate what is the actual commandment from the reason for the commandment. That is not a separate commandment. It's not part of this commandment. It should be looked at only as the reason for the commandment. Great. 6 and 7. Somebody wants to read?
When a mitzvah has both a positive command and a prohibition, the positive commandment is counted with the positive commandments and the prohibition with the prohibitions.
Great. So sometimes that was the two sides of the coin that I was mentioning earlier. Sometimes Maimonides will say there are two separate commands here. One is you will do this. The other one is you will not do that. They have to be put in the two different lists of commandments. Now, when I'm going to write my Mishit Torah, I'm going to bring them together. But for the purpose of counting the commandments, they're two separate commandments. 7th.
Do not count the details of a mitzvah themselves as a mitzvah. Then I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
So he's not including any of the rabbinic laws as commandments?
Nope, that was principle number 1. Rabbinic law is not, I don't include as a mitzvah.
So they're all Torah laws.
They're all Torah laws. The 613 that he presents are all Torah laws.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Next. It should be up, but for some reason it's not. Okay, I don't know why this is happening. There we go. Who wants to read 8th, 9th, 10th?
Do not
count.
I'm sorry.
Whoever started, go ahead. And then the second person, take the next one, please.
The 8th principle, do not count a mere negative statement among the prohibitions.
So let me explain the difference here. There is a prohibition and there is a negative statement. And Maimonides is saying statements are not commandments. We have to separate what is a statement from what is a commandment. Now, he's using these principles for himself, and it's completely irrelevant for us because once he made the list, we go by the list. But it's explaining what are the principles behind it. 9th. Henry, keep going.
The 9th principle, do not count the number of negative and positive statements, but the act which is prohibited or commanded.
Again, linked to the eighth, make sure that a statement is actually not listed. What is listed as a mitzvah, it's the act that you either have to do or that you're not allowed to do. 10th.
The 10th principle, do not count the act which precedes the mitzvah as a mitzvah.
For example, if I have to say a prayer before I do a mitzvah, that's just an act that needs to be done before the mitzvah. The mitzvah is the commandment. That's what he needs to list, which all makes sense. He's not giving us explanations. 11th.
The 11th principle, if one mitzvah includes a number of elements, do not count them separately.
Great. Otherwise, they're going to become 100 mitzvot just there. And 12th principle?
The 12th principle, when commanded to do a certain action, do not count each part of the action separately.
Great. So example for that, I'm going to take lighting Shabbat candles just because it's easy, although that is not one of the commandments. But for example, lighting Shabbat candles has certain steps, right? You have to put the candles in a certain way in a certain place. Then you have to strike a match. Then you have to light the candles. Then you have to say a blessing, right? For Maimonides, you can't have all of these things as separate. That's one thing, right? You don't count them separately. And the last two principles.
Although a certain mitzvah is performed for a number of days, this does not affect the number of mitzvot.
Easy case, Hanukkah candles. By the way, again, this is not a good example because that's rabbinic, but anyway, right? You don't count 8 separate mitzvot, right? Or a woman that is in a state of nidah for 7 days after her period, okay? She's in a state of quote impurity. I hate that word. You don't count that as day number 1 is one mitzvah, day number 2 is a separate mitzvah, even though, yes, it has to be done on day 1, on day 2, on day 3, on day 4, on day 5, but it's not a separate mitzvah. It's one mitzvah. And then last one.
14th principle, how one counts the modes of punishment as positive mitzvot.
So Maimonides is very careful with this. Modes of punishment are not mitzvot. Commandment is a commandment. What the things that will be done to you if you do not observe the commandment is not a commandment. It is just the consequence for not following the commandment. In the last slide that you had, I gave you 3 different links to list a list of Maimonides' 613 commandments. There are tons of places where you will find this. It's not like these 3, I just gave you 3. And actually, I now see that I gave you 2 that are alike, which obviously is wrong. I wanted to give you 3 different ones. So right now you have 2 different lists, but there are many online. If you look for online, search Google 613 mitzvot, according to Maimonides, you will get tons of lists. I actually have a printed list. It really is not that important, okay? What I want to do is I want to read, before I open this for discussion, I want to read to you the introduction that he gives to the positive mitzvot, and then the introduction that he gives to the negative mitzvot. And the reason I want to read it is because I think that it gives us some context of where my mind is coming from. So in his introduction of the positive mitzvot, he opens with a verse from the book of Deuteronomy at the very end of the book. Chapter 33, it says, the Torah which Moshe commanded us is the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. So this is what he says. This verse teaches us that from the moment a Jewish child is born, he or she acquires an infinitely abundant inheritance. The entire Torah belongs to him. Our sages, and he gives the source, explain that this verse also serves as the source which teaches us the exact number of mitzvot. So remember when Fran asked a question about the 613, and I said, yes, the 613 is coming from the Talmud. He's now going to explain how they got to 613. And now you will understand why the process is reverse, why we're not counting the commandments and saying, oh, look, it added up to 613. He says, if you take the word Torah and you look at the numerical value, the gematria of the word Torah, you will come to 611. Okay, if you would like me to go over how you get to 611, the Tav and the Resh, it's 400 and 200, so that's 600. The Vav is 6, and the Hey is 5. So it's 400 plus 200 plus 6 plus 5. Or if I really go in the order, is 400 plus 6 plus 200 plus 5. Okay, you add that up, that is 611. So this is continuing with Maimonides explaining and what is coming from the Talmud. Moshe conveyed 611 mitzvot to the Jewish people. Why? Because as the verse in Deuteronomy said, Moshe tziva Moshe kehilat Yaakov, right? So the inheritance of Jacob. This is the Torah which Moses commanded us and is the inheritance of the congregation of Jacob. So what is the Torah? The 611. Why? Because that's the numerical value of the word. And how do we get to 613? Well, the first of the 10 commandments, the first two of the 10 commandments were actually heard directly by the people from God. You may or not know this. There is a midrash that says that when God started giving the 10 commandments, he spoke the first commandment, he spoke the second commandment, and then the people said to Moshe, we can't handle this. If this is too much for us, you go up, you hear what God has to say, and you bring it back to us. So by assuming that the word Torah is valued in 611, plus the two that we all heard directly, then therefore, continue with Maimonides' words, there are a total of 613 mitzvot, which the Jewish people are commanded to observe. There is a very close bond between these mitzvot, the Torah which Moses commanded us, and Jewish children. Before God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, he demanded guarantors for this valuable treasure with which he had promised to entrust them. The only guarantors he was willing to accept were the Jewish children, and that is also coming from a midrash. Thus, it is the Jewish children's study and observance of these mitzvot which ensure our people's continued connection with the Torah. This set of books was composed with the intention of clearly outlining these mitzvot and describing them in a manner that will allow a youth or child to conceive of them in terms that he can relate to. Our definition of the 613 mitzvot is based on Sefer HaMitzvot, and it's going to be divided in two volumes, positive mitzvot and negative mitzvot. Every listing of a mitzvah will have two introductory lines. The first line gives us the number and the name for the mitzvah. And the second line will be the Hebrew verse from which the mitzvah is derived. Okay? Then he continues. We do not intend to give reasons for the mitzvot. And that's really important because that is how Maimonides felt, that we don't give any kind of explanation, because remember what I said, he says you can't really explain, you can't really understand, we can't really try to justify, we can't value mitzvot, it is what it is, okay? different. How many rabbinical commandments are there? So yes, there are different. They're not different numbers according to Judaism, the denominations, because for all denominations, what happens is either we go by what the rabbi said, the Talmud says, or we don't go by what the Talmud says, but what the Talmud says, the Talmud says. So there are several rabbinic commandments, but there are some that are more, it's difficult to apply this, to answer this. I'll tell you why. It depends on how you're going to define a rabbinic commandment. So if I go by the 14 principles of Maimonides, none of them is a commandment. If I try to read what is it that the rabbis added later, which could be read that way, then there are different ways of counting, just as there were different ways of counting originally in the 613. Most of those lists that had been published before Maimonides wrote his list included rabbinic commandments. Among them, lighting Shabbat candles, lighting Hanukkah candles, which are not biblical. There are some laws about family purity that come from the rabbinic editions, not exactly the Torah, etc. So it's hard to tell you how many there are because it depends on what are the principles that you're going to use to count them. Alexander.
Yes. So Maimonides is saying, that you do not give reasons. And a good example of that, which is brought up many times by many people, are the dietary laws. And it says explicitly, you shall not eat a pig. And then people say, well, in those days, pigs would eat garbage and they were unhealthy. But nowadays we feed pigs healthy food, feed, and therefore we should be allowed to eat pigs, pork chops and all of that nowadays. And no, there was no reason given, and therefore you can't really change the law. And that goes with a lot of the other dietary laws that are in the Torah.
Correct. The problem with trying to explain laws is the same problem that you have when you're raising your children, right? When you're raising children, when they're young, especially when they're young, if I give you a rule, you're going to follow my rule because it is my rule, because you live in my house and I am giving you a rule. I don't care if you understand it or not, if you like it or not. If it's based on understanding and agreeing, then it's not a rule. And that is the point. I like the way you said it, Alexander. That is the way we should understand mitzvot, right? Well, it doesn't make sense that I cannot mix linen and wool. You're absolutely right. It doesn't make sense. But God said that that's important. I don't know why. I have no idea why. But if I'm going to say, but I don't like it and I don't understand it and it makes no sense and I'm not going to follow, or if I'm going to say, as you said, well, but it's because in those days, then nothing is a commandment. Then everything is open to interpretation and everything is open to, do I like it? Do I want to do it? Do I agree with it? For Maimonides, there's no such thing. There's absolutely no such thing.
How does Maimonides address an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, as opposed to how the rabbinic?
So Maimonides accepts the rabbinic interpretation of the mitzvah. What he doesn't accept is the creation of a mitzvah. So he will absolutely go with the rabbinic interpretation. An eye for an eye does not mean that if somebody pulls out my eye, I should pull out somebody's eye. Right? That he's okay with. But he will not accept the mitzvah that is created by the rabbis as, it's not that he doesn't say you have to follow it. Trust me, I'm sure Maimonides had candles lit every Shabbat in his house. Whether it was his wife lighting him or him lighting him, that's a separate conversation, but I'm sure he lit candles. He just did not consider it as important to be part of the book that he was going to write. Another thing that I want to bring in is a very clear example of what we said about a positive mitzvah and a negative mitzvah, and how when Maimonides is going to write Mishneh Torah, he's not going to keep them separate in his writing. He's going to bring them together to discuss the concept. So for example, the first positive mitzvah is you have to believe in God, right? You have to believe in God. That's a positive mitzvah, according to Maimonides. However, believing in God, and when I say God, I mean the Jewish God. When you tell me that I have to believe in God, that does not automatically mean that I can't believe that there are other gods. I could believe in Hashem and then also believe in other gods. So therefore, there are two commandments. One commandment is you will believe in God. The second commandment is you will not have any other gods. That's a separate commandment, and that's negative, right? But of course, when Maimonides is going to discuss this in his Mishneh Torah, even though he listed them separately, one is a positive, one is a negative, he's going to bring them together because they actually form a complete unit. They form a category, a mitzvah that is a complete unit. However, they are going to have to be in separate lists. If you're just reading the list, you will actually have to encounter that. Does that make sense? Does everybody understand the difference between having two separate commandments and then bringing them together when he writes his book? Okay, so let me share my screen. I want to do something here. And I just want to give you an example. I'm going to share the screen. I just want to give you an example of what Maimonides does. Let me just find. Here we go. So this is one of the links that I gave you. Okay. So this is a list of the 613. And remember that I said that when he lists the commandments, he will always have the commandment and where he thinks this is coming from. Okay. So just as an example, so I'm going to scroll very quickly here to show you something. I'll come back. You see that there is, for example, fundamentals of Torah, and then he's going to go ahead and list all of them, right? Then he's going to have laws of character, laws of Torah study, laws of idolatry. So it's not just that he is listing the laws, but he's actually listing them under categories. So let's just take here an example. First commandment, according to him. Now, first does not mean that this is more important, right? But first commandment, to know that there is a God. Where does he get this from? Exodus 20, verse 2, chapter 20, verse 2. Second commandment, not to entertain thoughts of other gods besides him. So you here see the positive, the negative, they're being brought together. Because when he's going to structure his Mishneh Torah, these two things need to be together and not separate. Where does he get that from? Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. They're both, by the way, from the 10 Commandments. Commandment number 3, to know that God is one. But you also have to love him, and you have to fear him, and you have to sanctify his name, and you can't profane his name, and you can't destroy any object associated with his name. So note what happened here. To know that God is one, to love God, to fear God, to sanctify his name. These are all separate. And then not to profane his name, not to destroy objects associated with his name. By the way, some of you might know that is the reason why we have a geniza, right? If I have a piece of paper that has the name of God, the actual name of God, it cannot be put in the trash. Why? Because it says I cannot destroy. So it can't be put in the trash. Okay? To listen to the prophet that speaks in God's name, not to test the prophet. I mean, a lot of people, the rabbis that made the lists, did not put this as a commandment, not to test the prophet. What the heck does that mean? But Maimonides does. Laws of characters. You have to emulate God's way. You have to cleave to those who know him. You have to love Jews, you have to love converts. Then You have to not hate Jews. You have to reprove, but you can't embarrass. You can't oppress. You can't speak derogatorily of others. Can't take revenge. Cannot bear a grudge. And so he goes. And every time he gives a commandment, he gives you the source where he thinks this commandment is coming from. And you can see that this goes on and on and on until we get to 613. I know I'm scrolling really fast. I just want you to see that he keeps doing this until we get to commandment 613. Okay, so it's really a list that is very simple. When I say very simple, is not that the commandments are simple, but that it's very easy to find anything. Here are the categories. This is what you can't do. This is what you have to do. They're all there. And from this foundation, he's going to build the Mishneh Torah. And when we look at Mishneh Torah, we will understand a little better how this did serve as the foundation for his Mishneh Torah. Correct, Fran. They all had 613, but the lists were different. That's exactly it.
But then
The lists were exactly the same.
the lists were exactly the same in terms of 613, but they were different mitzvahs on different lists.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
then how would we know what to follow?
Oh, that's why Maimonides says, I don't like this.
Oh,
Now, the
Okay.
problem is Maimonides then says, I don't like this, and mine is the authoritative one. Right? Forget all those others. Look at mine.
okay.
Mine has principles, right? I think that what bothered Maimonides, and I think that it bothers him because he has a scientific mind, is that honestly, it's like trying to, I already know where I want to get and I want to prove, I'm going to work to prove what I want to do, which I hate to say this, but anybody here who went through a doctoral program, I don't care in what field, and had to write a doctoral dissertation, you know that that's the way it works, right? I have a hypothesis and I do whatever I can to prove my hypothesis right. Maimonides is bothered by that. That's not intellectually honest. On the other hand, sticks to that. Like we're all trying to get to 613 because the rabbi said it's 613. Maimonides does the same thing. So why does Maimonides think that his list is better than everybody else's? And the answer that he gives is because I have principles. I didn't just start counting and say, this is where this one comes in, that one doesn't come in, etc. He says, I have principles. I'm telling you what are my principles, what I decided to include, what I didn't decide to include. So yes, I also got to the 613 because that's what I had to get to, because the rabbis in the Talmud had already said 613. But what I did is I had a list of principles, coherent, and I stuck to this. And therefore my list is better than everybody else's. But as I said in the very beginning, the one thing you cannot say about Maimonides is that his humility is to be commended, right? He's not a humble person. Now, maybe he doesn't have to be humble, but you're correct. The lists were all different, including Maimonides' list is different from everybody else's list. But he feels that that's the right one. Everything else is not the right one. His list is the right one because he has a process and he can justify his process and he can explain to you exactly why this one yes and that one no.
So the Talmud is a combination of rabbinical laws and the 613 mitzvot.
The Talmud is, all of the commandments are listed in the Talmud. And they say that there's 613, but they're not counting. The Talmud is basically a mix of a legal code, stories, sermons, right? Talmud is a mishmash. It's very hard to say what Talmud is. Like, Talmud is not a legal code. Talmud is not a book of history, but there's history in the Talmud and there's legal code in the Talmud. Talmud is not rabbinic interpretation, but there's a lot of rabbinic interpretation in the Talmud. So Talmud is a whole compilation of conversations. That's the best way that I can explain. A compilation of conversations among rabbis. Joyce, Make sure you unmute.
Yeah, okay. So which are the 613 that we go by today?
We go by Maimonides. That is the accepted one today. Everybody goes by Maimonides. The others are simply no longer, nobody follows those. The accepted one is Maimonides. It's amazing that he was actually able to put them together and make them continue valid for the entire, ever after. I mean, unless somebody else comes and says other things, it's actually forever after. His list is the list that is valid. And I'm putting for whoever asked, I don't remember, I'm sorry who asked, but take a look. I just posted a link to the Mishneh Torah in English, the full Mishneh Torah in English. That's in Sefaria. That is free. You don't have to buy a book. It's not just one book. It would be several books. But this is a good place to start if you really love it. Now, again, this is Mishneh Torah. This is not the list of commandments, right? Sefer HaMitzvot, the list of commandments is somewhere else. Okay, what else? I know we're a little early, so let's just take the time to, ask more questions. Alex. Go ahead, you're fine.
Okay, yeah, I just noticed when you were listing the mitzvahs, at the end it said that you're not supposed to live in Egypt. Didn't Maimonides in Egypt?
Correct. And Maimonides has a whole explanation as to why he's living in Egypt. He was never intending to stay in Egypt, right? Remember that he was in Egypt because he was running away from persecution. But yes, that is one of the mitzvot. You're not supposed to live in Egypt. And let's note that there was a very large and strong community of Egyptian Jews in the Sephardic world for many years. I mean, I think the community today is basically decimated, but right. If you go through the list, there are some things, if you're interested in comparing the different lists, it's actually quite interesting to compare what people put it on a list or not put on a list, right? And why they choose to put or not. In general, and that's why Maimonides thinks his list is better. In general, it's a question of deciding this one yes, that one no. I mean, if I have to stick to 613 and I count and there are, let's say, 640, I just have to decide which ones are the ones I'm getting rid of. Maimonides says, I didn't do that. I had principles, right? But it is choosing. Now, it was the basis for his book, for Mishneh Torah, and it's incredible what he did with his Mishneh Torah is just amazing. I mean, I don't think we appreciate how incredible it is, because really he did take 63 volumes of Torah and just make it so easy, of Talmud, I'm sorry, and bring it and make it easy. Like if you read the English, I'm not going to say that it's a very easy read, but it's certainly easy to understand. I also don't think, when he says in his introduction that it's easy for children, I keep thinking, yeah, maybe your children, certainly not the children that I know, but still, it was a huge step in making it accessible to a population that was not necessarily well-versed in how to learn Talmud. I mean, if nothing else, Talmud was written in Aramaic. Who spoke Aramaic? Right, the Jerusalem Talmud is written in Hebrew, but we follow the Babylonian Talmud. Who the heck spoke Aramaic after you left Babylonia? Like, that's not a language that was part of your, vocabulary, unless that was what you did. If you spent all day in yeshiva, then yes, you spoke enough, at least Talmudic Aramaic, to understand the Talmud. But most of us are not versed in that. I will say that there is no way I can read a page of Talmud without a translation. I mean, I can understand, a sentence here, a sentence there, but to understand the full thought process on what's going on. There's no way. So by the time I get to the Mishneh Torah is much easier to understand. It just brings it all together. It makes it accessible. I don't know that it makes it accessible to children, but it does make it accessible to many of us who otherwise would not be able to follow. Henry.
Does Maimonides follow or make a distinction between the Maserati or proto-Maserati tradition versus the Septuagint tradition?
You mean from the Torah?
From the Torah.
He follows the original text. He does not follow the interpretation of the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a translation, and every translation is an interpretation. He goes by the original. He does not read the translation.
But isn't the what eventually became the Maserati, wasn't that a combination of, didn't they call different other sources that they liked?
Maimonides doesn't do that. He goes back, well, I understand what you're saying. He goes back to the accepted Torah text, which is not the Septuagint. So if you open a Torah, not a Torah, a Chumash, if you open a Chumash, most Chumashim have the Torah text, and next to the Torah text, you have the Onkelos text, which is slightly different and is more representative of the Septuagint. So you have both in most Chumashim. Maimonides goes by the text. Now, the text that we are using, which you're calling the Masoretic text, that is what is acceptable or is accepted as the basic Torah text. And Maimonides goes by that. He considers everything else to be interpretation. The truth is, everything is interpretation to a certain level. I mean, right? What word we use. So he tries to stay to the text that he thinks is most accurate, that is the text that Moshe received, which is the text that we use today in our Bibles. I mean, every movement, every Torah scroll has the same text, right? You may interpret it different, but a Sefer Torah in a Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Reconstructionist, Renewal, whatever synagogue is exactly the same. So the text is exactly the same. It is not different. That's the accepted text, and that's the text that Maimonides goes from. Alex?
A good example of what you were talking about interpretation and the Septuagint is in the Ten Commandments. It says, according to the Jewish way of interpreting it, says, you shall not murder. Whereas many other people who have translated the Bible translated it as you shall not kill.
Correct.
And there is very big difference between you shall not kill and you shall not murder.
Correct.
Murder is a legal, term. Correct. And you shall not kill means you cannot kill in a legal sense.
Right.
The judge
different things, and all of our safe, Sifrei Torah in every synagogue, what you have in that Sefer Torah is do not murder. Now you can translate it in whatever way you want, but the text says do not murder. It doesn't say do not kill. You're absolutely correct. Great example. Any other questions? Great. So I'll see everybody next week. Kim, any announcements?